Subcommittee by Zenna Henderson. Originally published in the July 1962 issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Republished in the 8th Annual Year's Best Science Fiction in December 1963, and again in a collection of the author's stories entitled The Anything Box in 1966. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Subcommittee. First came the sleek black ships falling out of the sky in patterned disorder, sowing fear as they settled like seeds on the broad landing field. After them, like bright butterflies, came the vividly colored slow ships that hovered and hesitated and came to rest scattered among the deadly dark ones. "Beautiful," sighed Serena, turning from the conference room window. "There should have been music to go with it." "A funeral dirge," said Thorne, "or a requiem, or flutes before failure. Frankly, I'm frightened, Rena. If these conferences fail, all hell will break loose again. Imagine living another year like this past one." "But the conference won't fail," Serena protested. "If they're willing to consent to the conference, surely they'll be willing to work with us for peace." "Their peace or ours?" asked Thorne, staring morosely out the window. "I'm afraid we're being entirely too naive about this whole affair. It's been a long time since we were finally able to say, 'Ain't gonna study war no more,' and made it stick. We've lost a lot of the cunning that used to be necessary in dealing with other people. We can't, even now, be sure this isn't a trick to get all our high command together in one place for a grand massacre." "Oh, no!" Serena pressed close to him, and his arm went around her. "They couldn't possibly violate—" "Couldn't they?" Thorne pressed his cheek to the top of her ear. "We don't know, Rena. We just don't know. We have so little information about them. We know practically nothing about their customs, even less about their values, or from what frame of reference they look upon our suggestion of suspending hostilities. But surely they must be sincere. They brought their families along with them. You did say those bright ships are family craft, didn't you?" "Yes, they suggested we bring our families, and they brought their families along with them, but it's nothing to give us comfort. They take them everywhere, even into battle." "Into battle?" "Yes, they mass the homecraft off out of range during battles, but every time we disable or blast one of their fighters, one or more of the homecraft spin away out of control or flare into nothingness. Apparently they're just glorified trailers, dependent on the fighters for motive power and everything else." The unhappy lines deepened in Thorne's face. "They don't know it, but even apart from their superior weapons, they practically forced us into this truce. How could we go on wiping out their war fleet when, with every black ship, those confounded posy-colored homecraft fell too, like pulling petals off a flower, and each petal heavy with the lives of women and children?" Serena shivered and pressed closer to Thorne. "The conference must work. We just can't have war anymore. You've got to get through to them. Surely, if we want peace, and so do they, we don't know what they want," said Thorne heavily. "Invaders, aggressors, strangers from hostile worlds, so completely alien to us, how can we ever hope to get together?" They left the conference room in silence, snapping the button on the doorknob before they closed it. "Hey, look it! Mommy! Here's a wall!" Splinter's 5-year-old hands flattened themselves like grubby starfish against the greenish ripple of the 10-foot vitricrete fence that wound through the trees and slid down the gentle curve of the hill. "Where did it come from? What's it for? How come we can't go play in the Go Fish pond anymore?" Serena leaned her hand against the wall. The people who came in the pretty ships wanted a place to walk and play too, so the construction corp put the fence up for them. Why won't they let me play in the go fish pond? Splinter's brows bent ominously. They don't know you want to, said Serena. I'll tell them then, said Splinter. He threw his head back. Hey, over there, he yelled, his fists doubling and his whole body stiffening with the intensity of the shout. Hey, I want to play in the go fish pond. Serena laughed. Hush, Splinter. Even if they could hear you, they wouldn't understand. They're from far, far away. They don't talk the way we do. But maybe we could play, said Splinter wistfully. Yes, sighed Serena. Maybe you could play, if the fence weren't there. But you see, Splinter, we don't know what kind of people they are, whether they would want to play, whether they would be nice. Well, how can we find out with that old wall there? We can't, Splinter, said Serena. Not with the fence there. They walked on down the hill, Splinter's hand trailing along the wall. Maybe they're mean, he said finally. Maybe they're so bad that the Struction Corp had to build a cage for them, a big, big cage. He stretched his arm as high as he could reach up the wall. Do you suppose they got tails? Tails? Laughed Serena. Whatever gave you that idea? I don't know. They came from a long ways away. I'd like a tail, a long curly one with fur on. He swished his miniature behind energetically. Whatever for? Asked Serena. It'd come in handy, said Splinter solemnly. For climbing and keeping my neck warm. Why aren't there any other kids here? He asked as they reached the bottom of the slope. I'd like somebody to play with. Well, Splinter, it's kind of hard to explain, started Serena, sinking down on the narrow ledge, shelving on the tiny dry watercourse at her feet. Don't explain, then, said Splinter. Just tell me. Well, some Lingenai generals came in the big black ships to talk with General Worsham and some more of our generals. They brought their families with them in the fat, pretty ships. So our generals brought their families, too, but your daddy is the only one of our generals who has a little child. All the others are grown up. That's why there's no one for you to play with. I wish it were as simple as it sounds, thought Serena, suddenly weary again with the weeks of negotiation and waiting that had passed. Oh, said Splinter thoughtfully, then there are kids on the other side of the wall, aren't there? Yes, there must be young Lingenai, said Serena. I guess you could call them children. Splinter slid down to the bottom of the little watercourse and flopped down on his stomach. He pressed his cheek to the sand and peered through a tiny gap left under the fence where it crossed the stream bed. I can't see anybody, he said, disappointed. They started back up the hill toward their quarters, walking silently, Splinter's hand whispering along the wall. Mommy? Splinter said as they neared the patio. Yes, Splinter. That fence is to keep them in, isn't it? Yes, said Serena. It doesn't feel like that to me, said Splinter. It feels like it's to shut me out. Serena suffered through the next days with Thorn. She lay wide-eyed beside him in the darkness of their bedroom, praying as he slept restlessly, struggling, even in his sleep, groping for a way. Tight-lipped, she cleared away untouched meals and brewed more coffee. Her thoughts went hopefully with him every time he started out with new hope and resolution, and her spirits flagged and fell as he brought back dead end, stalemate, and growing despair. And in between times, she tried to keep Splinter on as even a keel as possible, giving him the freedom of the quarters area during the long, sunlit days and playing with him as much as possible in the evenings. One evening, Serena was pinning up her hair and keeping half an eye on Splinter as he splashed in his bath. He was gathering up handsful of foaming soap bubbles and pressing them to his chin and cheeks. "Now I have to shave like Daddy," he hummed to himself. "Shave, shave, shave." He flicked the suds off with his forefinger. Then he scooped up a big double handful of bubbles and pressed them all over his face. "Now I'm Doovie. I'm all over fuzzy like Doovie. Look at Mommy, I'm all over—" He opened his eyes and peered through the suds to see if she was watching. Consequently, Serena spent a busy next few minutes helping him get the soap out of his eyes. When the tears had finally washed away the trouble, Serena sat toweling Splinter's relaxed little body. "I bet Doovie'd cry too if he got soap in his eyes," he said with a sniff. "Wouldn't he, Mommy?" "Doovie?" said Serena. "Probably almost anyone would. Who's Doovie?" She felt Splinter stiffen on her lap. His eyes wandered away from hers. "Mommy, do you think Daddy will play with me tomorrow?" "Perhaps." She captured one of his wet feet. "Who's Doovie?" "Can we have pink cake for dessert tonight? I think I like pink—" "Who's Doovie?" Serena's voice was firm. Splinter examined his thumbnail critically, then peered up at Serena out of the corner of his eye. "Doovie," he began. "Doovie's a little boy." "Oh?" said Serena. "A play-like little boy?" "No," Splinter whispered, hanging his head. "A real little boy. A Lingonite little boy." Serena drew an astonished breath, and Splinter hurried on, his eyes intent on hers. "He's nice people, Mommy, honest. He doesn't say bad words or tell lies or talk sassy to his mother. He can run as fast as I can, faster if I stumble. He... His eyes dropped again. "I like him." His mouth quivered. How could, the fence... Serena was horrified and completely at a loss for words. "I dug a hole," confessed Splinter. "Under the fence where the sand is. You didn't say not to. Doovie came to play. His mommy came too. She's pretty. Her fur is pink, but Doovie's is nice and green, all over." Splinter got excited. "All over, even where his clothes are, all but his nose and eyes and ears and the front of his hands." "But, Splinter, how could you? You might have got hurt. They might have—" Serena hugged him tight to hide her face from him. Splinter squirmed out of her arms. "Doovie wouldn't hurt anyone. You know what, Mommy? He can shut his nose. Yes, he can. He can shut his nose and fold up his ears. I wish I could. It'd come in handy. But I'm bigger than he is, and I can sing, and he can't. But he can whistle with his nose, and when I try, I just blow mine. Doovie's nice." Serena's mind was churning as she helped Splinter get into his night clothes. She felt the chill of fear along her forearms and the back of her neck. What to do now? Forbid Splinter's crawling under the fence? Keep him from possible danger that might just be biding its time? What would Thorn say? Should she tell him? This might precipitate an incident that... "Splinter, how many times have you played with Doovie?" "How many?" Splinter's chest swelled under his clean pajamas. "Let me count," he said importantly, and murmured and mumbled over his fingers for a minute. 4 times, he proclaimed triumphantly. 1, 2, 3, 4 whole times. "Weren't you scared?" "Naw," he said, adding hastily, "Well, maybe a little bit the first time. I thought maybe they might have tails that like to curl around people's necks, but they haven't." Disappointed. "Only clothes on, like us, with fur on under." "Did you say you saw Doovie's mother, too?" "Sure," said Splinter. "She was there the first day. She was the one that sent all the others away when they all crowded around me. All grown-ups. Not any kids excepting Doovie. They kind of pushed and wanted to touch me, but she told them to go away, and they all did, excepting her and Doovie." "Oh, Splinter," cried Serena, overcome by the vision of his small self surrounded by pushing, crowding Lingonai grown-ups who wanted to touch him. "What's the matter, Mommy?" asked Splinter. "Nothing, dear." She wet her lips. "May I go along with you the next time you go to see Doovie? I'd like to meet his mother." "Sure, sure," cried Splinter. "Let's go now. Let's go now." "Not now," said Serena, feeling the reaction of her fear in her knees and ankles. "It's too late. Tomorrow we'll go see them. And Splinter, let's not tell Daddy yet. Let's keep it a surprise for a while." "Okay, Mommy," said Splinter. "It's a good surprise, isn't it? You were awful surprised, weren't you?" "Yes, I was," said Serena. "Awful surprised." Next day, Splinter squatted down and inspected the hole under the fence. "It's kind of little," he said. "Maybe you'll get stuck." Serena, her heart pounding in her throat, laughed. "That wouldn't be very dignified, would it?" she asked, "to go calling and get stuck in the door." Splinter laughed. "It'd be funny," he said. "Maybe we better go find a really door for you." "Oh, no," said Serena hastily. "We can make this one bigger." "Sure," said Splinter. "I'll go get Doovie and he can help dig." "Fine," said Serena, her throat tightening. Afraid of a child, she mocked herself. Afraid of a Lingonai. Aggressor, invader, she defended. Splinter flattened on the sand and slid under the fence. "You start digging," he called. "I'll be back." Serena knelt to the job, the loose sand coming away so readily that she circled her arms and dredged with them. Then she heard Splinter scream. For a brief second she was paralyzed. Then he screamed again, closer, and Serena dragged the sand away in a frantic frenzy. She felt the sand scoop down the neck of her blouse and the skin scrape off her spine as she forced herself under the fence. Then there was Splinter, catapulting out of the shrubbery, sobbing and screaming. "Doovie! Doovie's drowning! He's in the go-fish pond, all under the water! I can't get him out! Mommy! Mommy!" Serena grabbed his hand as she shot past and towed him along, stumbling and dragging as she ran for the goldfish pond. She leaned across the low wall and caught a glimpse, under the churning thrash of the water, of green mossy fur and staring eyes. With hardly a pause except to shove Splinter backward and start a deep breath, she plunged over into the pond. She felt the burning bite of water up her nostrils and grappled in the murky darkness for Doovie, feeling again and again the thrash of small limbs that slipped away before she could grasp them. Then she was choking and sputtering on the edge of the pond, pushing the still struggling Doovie up and over. Splinter grabbed him and pulled as Serena heaved herself over the edge of the pond and fell sprawling across Doovie. Then she heard another, higher, shriller scream and was shoved off Doovie viciously, and Doovie was snatched up into rose-pink arms. Serena pushed her lank, dripping hair out of her eyes and met the hostile glare of the rose-pink eyes of Doovie's mother. Serena edged over to Splinter and held him close, her eyes intent on the Lingonai. The pink mother felt the green child all over anxiously, and Serena noticed with an odd detachment that Splinter hadn't mentioned that Doovie's eyes matched his fur and that he had webbed feet. Webbed feet! She began to laugh, almost hysterically. Oh, Lordy! No wonder Doovie's mother was so alarmed. "Can you talk to Doovie?" asked Serena of the sobbing Splinter. "No!" wailed Splinter. "You don't have to talk to play." "Stop crying, Splinter," said Serena. "Help me think. Doovie's mother thinks we were trying to hurt Doovie. He wouldn't drown in the water. Remember, he can close his nose and fold up his ears. How are we going to tell his mother we weren't trying to hurt him? Well, Splinter scrubbed his cheeks with the back of his hand. We could hug him. That wouldn't do, Splinter, said Serena, noticing with near panic that other brightly colored figures were moving among the shrubs, drawing closer. I'm afraid she won't let us touch him. Briefly, she toyed with the idea of turning and trying to get back to the fence. Then she took a deep breath and tried to calm down. Let's play like, Splinter, she said. Let's show Doovie's mother that we thought he was drowning. You go fall in the pond and I'll pull you out. You play like drowned and I'll cry. Gee, Mommy, you're crying already, said Splinter, his face puckering. I'm just practicing, she said, steadying her voice. Go on. Splinter hesitated on the edge of the pond, shrinking away from the water that had fascinated him so many times before. Serena screamed suddenly, and Splinter, startled, lost his balance and fell in. Serena had hold of him almost before he went underwater and pulled him out, cramming as much of fear and apprehension into her voice and actions as she could. Be dead, she whispered fiercely. Be dead all over. And Splinter melted so completely in her arms that her moans and cries of sorrow were only partly make-believe. She bent over his still form and rocked to and fro in her grief. A hand touched her arm, and she looked up into the bright eyes of the Lingonai. The look held for a long moment, and then the Lingonai smiled, showing even white teeth, and a pink, furry hand patted Splinter on the shoulder. His eyes flew open, and he sat up. Doovie peered around from behind his mother, and then he and Splinter were rolling and tumbling together, wrestling happily between the two hesitant mothers. Serena found a shaky laugh somewhere in among her alarms, and Doovie's mother whistled softly with her nose. That night, Thorn cried out in his sleep and woke Serena. She lay in the darkness, her constant prayer moving like a candle flame in her mind. She crept out of bed and checked Splinter in his shadowy room. Then she knelt and opened the bottom drawer of Splinter's chest robe. She ran her hand over the gleaming folds of the length of Lingonai material that lay there, the material the Lingonai had found to wrap her in while her clothes dried. She had given them her lacy slip in exchange. Her fingers read the raised pattern in the dark, remembering how beautiful it was in the afternoon sun. Then the sun was gone, and she saw a black ship destroyed, a home craft, plunging to incandescent death, and the pink and green and yellow and all the other bright furs charring and crisping, and the patterned materials curling before the last flare of flame. She leaned her head on her hand and shuddered. But then she saw the glitter of a silver ship, blackening and fusing, dripping monstrously against the emptiness of space, and heard the wail of a fatherless Splinter so vividly that she shoved the drawer in hastily and went back to look at his quiet, sleeping face and to tuck him unnecessarily in. When she came back to bed, Thorn was awake, lying on his back, his elbows winging out. Awake? She asked as she sat down on the edge of the bed. Yes. His voice was tense as the twang of a wire. We're getting nowhere, he said. Both sides keep holding up neat little hoops of ideas, but no one is jumping through either way. We want peace, but we can't seem to convey anything to them. They want something, but they haven't said what, as though to tell us would betray them irrevocably into our hands. But they won't make peace unless they can get it. Where do we go from here? If they just go away... Rena swung her feet up onto the bed and clasped her slender ankles with both hands. That's one thing we've established. Thorn's voice was bitter. They won't go. They're here to stay, like it or not. Thorn... Rena spoke impulsively into the shadowy silence. "Why don't we just make them welcome? Why can't we just say, 'Come on in. They're travelers from afar. Can't we be hospitable?' You talk as though the afar was just the next county or state." Thorne tossed impatiently on the pillow. "Don't tell me we're back to that old equation. Stranger equals enemy," said Rena, her voice sharp with strain. "Can't we assume they're friendly? Go visit with them? Talk with them casually?" "Friendly!" Thorne shot upright from the tangled bedclothes. "Go visit? Talk!" His voice choked off. Then, carefully, calmly, he went on. "Would you care to visit with the widows of our men who went to visit the friendly Lingenai, whose ships dripped out of the sky without warning? Theirs did too." Rena's voice was small but stubborn. "With no more warning than we had. Who shot first? You must admit no one knows for sure." There was a tense silence. Then Thorne lay down slowly, turned his back to Serena, and spoke no more. "Now I can't ever tell," mourned Serena into her crumpled pillow. "He'd die if he knew about the hole under the fence." In the days that followed, Serena went every afternoon with Splinter, and the hole under the fence got larger and larger. Duvey's mother, whom Splinter called Mrs. Pink, was teaching Serena to embroider the rich materials like the length they had given her. In exchange, Serena was teaching Mrs. Pink how to knit. At least, she started to teach her. She got as far as purl and knit, decrease and increase, when Mrs. Pink took the work from her, and Serena sat wide-mouthed at the incredible speed and accuracy of Mrs. Pink's furry fingers. She felt a little silly for having assumed that the Lingenai didn't know anything about knitting. And yet the other Lingenai crowded around and felt of the knitting and exclaimed over it in their soft, fluty voices as though they'd never seen any before. The little ball of wool Serena had brought was soon used up, but Mrs. Pink brought out hanks of heavy thread, such as were split and used in their embroidery, and after a glance through Serena's pattern book, settled down to knitting the shining brilliance of Lingenai thread. Before long, smiles and gestures, laughter and whistling were not enough. Serena sought out the available tapes, a scant handful, on Lingenai speech and learned them. They didn't help much, since the vocabulary wasn't easily applied to the matters she wanted to discuss with Mrs. Pink and the others. But the day she voiced and whistled her first Lingenai sentence to Mrs. Pink stumbled through her first English sentence. They laughed and whistled together and settled down to pointing and naming and guessing across areas of incommunication. Serena felt guilty by the end of the week. She and Splinter were having so much fun, and Thorne was wearier and wearier at each session's end. "They're impossible," he said bitterly one night, crouched forward tensely on the edge of his easy chair. "We can't pin them down to anything." "What do they want?" asked Serena. "Haven't they said yet?" "I shouldn't talk." Thorne sank back in his chair. "Oh, what does it matter?" he asked wearily. "It'll all come to nothing anyway." "Oh, no, Thorne," cried Serena. "They're reasonable, human—" She broke off at Thorne's surprised look. "Aren't they?" she stammered. "Aren't they?" "Human? They're uncommunicative, hostile aliens," he said. "We talk ourselves blue in the face, and they just whistle at one another and say yes or no. Just that, flatly." "Do they understand—" began Serena. "We have interpreters, such as they are, none too good, but all we have." "Well, what are they asking?" asked Serena. Thorne laughed shortly. So far as we've been able to ascertain, they just want all our oceans and the land contiguous thereto. Oh, Thorn, they couldn't be that unreasonable. Well, I'll admit we aren't even sure that's what they mean, but they keep coming back to the subject of the oceans, except they whistle rejection when we ask them point blank if it's the oceans they want. There's just no communication. Thorn sighed heavily. You don't know them like we do, Rena. No, said Serena miserably. Not like you do. She took her disquiet, Splinter, and a picnic basket down the hill to the hole next day. Mrs. Pink had shared her lunch with them the day before, and now it was Serena's turn. They sat on the grass together, Serena crowding back her unhappiness to laugh at Mrs. Pink and her first olive with the same friendly amusement Mrs. Pink had shown when Serena had bit down on her first peerwit and had been afraid to swallow it and ashamed to spit it out. Splinter and Doovie were agreeing over a thick meringued lemon pie which was supposed to be dessert. "Leave the pie alone, Splinter," said Serena. "It's to top off on." "We're only tasting the fluffy stuff," said Splinter, a blob of meringue on his upper lip bobbing as he spoke. "Well, save your testing for later. Why don't you get out the eggs? I'll bet Doovie isn't familiar with them either." Splinter rummaged in the basket, and Serena took out the huge camp salt shaker. "Here they are, Mommy," cried Splinter. "Look it, Doovie. First you have to crack the shell." Serena began initiating Mrs. Pink into the mysteries of hard-boiled eggs, and it was all very casual and matter-of-fact until she sprinkled the peeled egg with salt. Mrs. Pink held out her cupped hand, and Serena sprinkled a little salt into it. Mrs. Pink tasted it. She gave a low whistle of astonishment and tasted again. Then she reached tentatively for the shaker. Serena gave it to her, amused. Mrs. Pink shook more into her hand and peered through the holes in the cap of the shaker. Serena unscrewed the top and showed Mrs. Pink the salt inside it. For a long minute, Mrs. Pink stared at the white granules, and then she whistled urgently, piercingly. Serena shrank back, bewildered, as every bush seemed to erupt Linge. They crowded around Mrs. Pink, staring into the shaker, jostling one another, whistling softly. One scurried away and brought back a tall jug of water. Mrs. Pink slowly and carefully emptied the salt from her hand into the water and then upended the shaker. She stirred the water with a branch someone snatched from a bush. After the salt was dissolved, all the Lingenei around them lined up with cupped hands. Each received, as though it were a sacrament, a handful of salt water. And they all, quickly, not to lose a drop, lifted the handful of water to their faces and inhaled, breathing deeply, deeply of the salty solution. Mrs. Pink was last, and as she raised her wet face from her cupped hands, the gratitude in her eyes almost made Serena cry. And the dozens of Lingenei crowded around, each eager to press a soft forefinger to Serena's cheek, a thank-you gesture Splinter was picking up already. When the crowd melted into the shadows again, Mrs. Pink sat down, fondling the salt shaker. "Salt," said Serena, indicating the shaker. "Shreeprill," said Mrs. Pink. "Shreeprill?" said Serena, her stumbling tongue robbing the word of its liquidness. Mrs. Pink nodded. "Shreeprill good?" asked Serena, groping for an explanation for the just-finished scene. "Shreeprill good," said Mrs. Pink. "No Shreeprill, no Lingenei baby. Doovie, she hesitated, groping. "One Doovie, no baby." She shook her head, unable to bridge the gap. Serena groped after an idea she had almost caught from Mrs. Pink. She pulled up a handful of grass. Grass, she said. She pulled another handful. More grass. More. More. She added to the pile. Mrs. Pink looked from the grass to Serena. No more, Lingenai baby. Doovy. She separated the grass into piles. Baby, baby, baby. She counted down to the last one, lingering tenderly over it. Doovy. Oh, said Serena. Doovy is the last Lingenai baby? No more? Mrs. Pink studied the words, and then she nodded. Yes, yes, no more, no Shreeprill, no baby. Serena felt a flutter of wonder. Maybe this is what the war was over. Maybe they just wanted salt. A world to them. Maybe salt. Shreeprill? She said. More Shreeprill, Lingenai go home? More Shreeprill, yes, said Mrs. Pink. Go home? No home. Home no good. No water, no Shreeprill. Oh, said Serena. Then, thoughtfully, more Lingenai? More? Mrs. Pink looked at Serena, and in the sudden silence, the realization that they were, after all, members of enemy camps flared between them. Serena tried to smile. Mrs. Pink looked over at Splinter and Doovy, who were happily sampling everything in the picnic basket. Mrs. Pink relaxed, and then she said, No more Lingenai. She gestured toward the crowded landing field. Lingenai. She pressed her hands, palm to palm, her shoulders sagging. No more Lingenai. Serena sat dazed, thinking what this would mean to Earth's high command. No more Lingenai of the terrible, devastating weapons, no more than those that had landed. No waiting alien world ready to send reinforcements when these ships were gone. When these were gone, no more Lingenai. All that Earth had to do now was wipe out these ships, taking the heavy losses that would be inevitable, and they would win the war and wipe out a race. The Lingenai must have come seeking asylum, or demanding it. Neighbors, who were afraid to ask, or hadn't been given time to ask. How had the war started? Who fired upon whom? Did anyone know? Serena took uncertainty home with her, along with the empty picnic basket. Tell, whispered her feet through the grass up the hill. Tell, and the war will end. But how? She cried out to herself. By wiping them out or giving them a home. Which? Kill, grated her feet across the graveled patio edge. Kill the aliens? No common ground, not human, all our hallowed dead. But what about their hallowed dead? All falling, the flaming ships, the homeseekers, the dispossessed, the childless. Serena settled Splinter with a new puzzle and a picture book and went into the bedroom. She sat on the bed and stared at herself in the mirror. But give them salt water and they'll increase. All our oceans, even if they said they didn't want them, increase and take the world, push us out, trespass, oppress. But their men, our men. They've been meeting for over a week and can't agree. Of course they can't. They're afraid of betraying themselves to each other. Neither knows anything about the other, really. They aren't trying to find out anything really important. I'll bet not one of our men know the Lingonai can close their noses and fold their ears, and not one of the Lingonai knows we sprinkle their life on our food. Serena had no idea how long she sat there, but Splinter finally found her and insisted on supper, and then Serena insisted on bed for him. She was nearly mad with indecision when Thorn finally got home. "Well," he said, dropping wearily into his chair, "it's almost over." "Over?" cried Serena, hope flaring. "Then you've reached stalemate." "Impasse," said Thorn heavily. "Our meeting tomorrow is the last. One final no from each side, and it's over. Back to bloodletting." "Oh, Thorn, no!" Serena pressed her clenched fist to her mouth. "We can't kill any more of them. It's inhuman. It's self-defense." Thorn's voice was sharp with exasperated displeasure. "Please, not tonight, Rena. Spare me your idealistic ideas. Heaven knows we're inexperienced enough in warlike negotiations without having to cope with suggestions that we make cute pets out of our enemies. We're in a war, and we've got it to win. Let the Lingonai get a wedge in, and they'll swarm the earth like flies." "No, no," whispered Serena, her own secret fears sending the tears flooding down her face. They wouldn't, would they?" Long after Thorn's sleeping breath whispered in the darkness beside her, she lay awake, staring at the invisible ceiling. Carefully she put the words up before her on the slate of the darkness. "Tell. The war will end. Either we will help the Lingonai or wipe them out. Don't tell. The conference will break up. The war will go on. We will have heavy losses and wipe the Lingonai out. Mrs. Pink trusted me. Splinter loves Duvy. Duvy loves him." Then the little candle flame of prayer that had so nearly burned out in her torment flared brightly again, and she slept. Next morning she sent Splinter to play with Duvy. "Play by the goldfish pond," she said. "I'll be along soon." "Okay, Mommy," said Splinter. "Will you bring some cake?" Slyly. "Duvy isn't familiar with cake." Serena laughed. "A certain little Splinter is familiar with cake, though. You run along, Greedy." And she boosted him out of the door with a slap on the rear. "Bye, Mommy," he called back. "Bye, dear. Be good." "I will." Serena watched until he disappeared down the slope of the hill. Then she smoothed her hair and ran her tongue over her lips. She started for the bedroom, but turned suddenly and went to the front door. If she had to face even her own eyes, her resolution would waver and dissolve. She stood, hand on knob, watching the clock inch around until an interminable 15 minutes had passed, Splinter safely gone. Then she snatched the door open and left. Her smile took her out of the quarters area to the administration building. Her brisk assumption of authority and destination took her to the conference wing, and there her courage failed her. She lurked out of the sight of the guards, almost wringing her hands in indecision. Then she straightened the set of her skirt, smoothed her hair, dredged a smile up from some hidden source of strength, and tiptoed out into the hall. She felt like a butterfly pinned to the wall by the instant unwinking attention of the guards. She gestured silence with a finger to her lips and tiptoed up to them. "Hello, Turner. Hi, Frenivari," she whispered. The two exchanged looks, and Turner said hoarsely, "You aren't supposed to be here, ma'am. Better go." "I know I'm not," she said, looking guilty with no effort at all. "But, Turner, I just want to see a Lingonai. She hurried on before Turner's open mouth could form a word. Oh, I've seen pictures of them, but I'd like awfully to see a real one. Can't I have even one little peek? She slipped closer to the door. Look, she cried softly. It's even ajar a little already. Supposed to be, rasped Turner. Orders. But, ma'am, we can't. Just one peek, she pleaded, putting her thumb in the crack of the door. I won't make a sound. She coaxed the door open a little farther, her hand creeping inside, fumbling for the knob, the little button. But, ma'am, you couldn't see him from here anyway. Quicker than thought, Serena jerked the door open and darted in, pushing the little button and slamming the door with what seemed to her a thunder that vibrated through the whole building. Breathlessly, afraid to think, she sped through the anteroom into the conference room. She came to a scared, skidding stop, her hands tight on the back of a chair, every eye in the room on her. Thorne, almost unrecognizable in his armor of authority and severity, stood up abruptly. "Serena!" he said, his voice cracking with incredulity. Then he sat down again, hastily. Serena circled the table, refusing to meet the eyes that bored into her. Blue eyes, brown eyes, black eyes, yellow eyes, green eyes, lavender eyes. She turned at the foot of the table and looked fearfully up the shining expanse. "Gentlemen," her voice was almost inaudible. She cleared her throat. "Gentlemen." She saw General Worsham getting ready to speak, his face harshly unfamiliar with the weight of his position. She pressed her hands to the polished table and leaned forward hastily. "You're going to quit, aren't you? You're giving up." The translators bent to their mics and their lips moved to hers. "What have you been talking about all this time? Guns? Battles? Casualty lists? We'll do this to you if you do that to us? I don't know," she cried, shaking her head tightly, almost shuddering. "I don't know what goes on at high-level conference tables. All I know is that I've been teaching Mrs. Pink to knit and how to cut a lemon pie." She could see the bewildered interpreters thumbing their manuals. "And already I know why they're here and what they want." Pursing her lips, she half whistled, half trilled in her halting Lingonai. "Doovie baby. No more Lingonai babies." One of the Lingonai started at Doovie's name and stood up slowly, his lavender bulk towering over the table. Serena saw the interpreters thumbing frantically again. She knew they were looking for a translation of the Lingonai baby. Babies had no place in a military conference. The Lingonai spoke slowly, but Serena shook her head. "I don't know enough Lingonai." There was a whisper at her shoulder. "What do you know of Doovie?" And a pair of earphones were pushed into her hands. She adjusted them with trembling fingers. Why were they letting her talk? Why was General Worsham sitting there letting her break into the conference like this? "I know Doovie," she said breathlessly. "I know Doovie's mother, too. Doovie plays with Splinter, my son, my little son." She twisted her fingers, dropping her head at the murmur that arose around the table. The Lingonai spoke again, and the metallic murmur of the earphones gave her the translation. "What is the color of Doovie's mother?" "Pink," said Serena. Again the scurry for a word. Pink. Pink. Finally, Serena turned up the hem of her skirt and displayed the hem of her slip, rose pink. The Lingonai sat down again, nodding. "Serena," General Worsham spoke as quietly as though it were just another lounging evening in the patio, "what do you want?" Serena's eyes wavered, and then her chin lifted. "Thorne said today would be the last day, that it was to be no on both sides. that we and the Lingonai have no common meeting ground, no basis for agreement on anything. And you think we have? General Worsham's voice cut gently through the stir at the naked statement of thoughts and attitudes so carefully concealed. I know we do. Our likenesses outweigh our differences so far that it's just foolish to sit here all this time, shaking our differences at each other and not finding out a thing about our likenesses. We're fundamentally the same, she faltered. Under God, we are all the same. And she knew with certainty that the translators wouldn't find God's name in their books. I think we ought to let them eat our salt and bread and make them welcome. She half smiled and said, The word for salt is shripril. There was a smothered rush of whistling from the Lingonai, and the lavender Lingonai half rose from his chair but subsided. General Worsham glanced at the Lingonai speculatively and pursed his lips. But there are ramifications, he began. Ramifications, spat Serena. There are no ramifications that can't resolve themselves if two peoples really know each other. She glanced around the table, noting with sharp relief that Thorn's face had softened. Come with me, she urged. Come and see Duvey and Splinter together. Lingonai, young, and ours, who haven't learned suspicion and fear and hate and prejudice yet. Declare a recess or a truce or whatever is necessary, and come with me. After you see the children and see Mrs. Pink knitting and we talk this matter over like members of a family, well, if you still think you have to fight after that, then... She spread her hands. Her knees shook so as they started downhill that Thorn had to help her walk. Oh, Thorn, she whispered, almost sobbing. I didn't think they would. I thought they'd shoot me or lock me up or... We don't want war. I told you that, he murmured. We're ready to grab at straws, even in the guise of snippy females who barge in on solemn councils and display their slips. Then his lips tightened. How long has this been going on? For Splinter, a couple of weeks. For me, a little more than a week. Why didn't you tell me? I tried. Twice. You wouldn't listen. I was too scared to insist. Besides, you know what your reaction would have been. Thorn had no words until they neared the foot of the hill. Then he said, How come you know so much? What makes you think you can solve... Serena choked back a hysterical laugh. I took eggs to a picnic. And then they were standing, looking down at the hole under the fence. Splinter found the way, Serena defended. I made it bigger, but you'll have to get down flat. She dropped to the sand and wiggled under. She crouched on the other side, her knees against her chest, her clasped hands pressed against her mouth, and waited. There was a long minute of silence, and then a creak and a grunt, and Serena bit her lips as General Worsham inched under the fence, flat on the sand, catching and jerking free halfway through. But her amusement changed to admiration as she realized that even covered with dust, scrambling awkwardly to his feet and beating his rumpled clothing, he possessed dignity and strength that made her deeply thankful that he was the voice of Earth in this time of crisis. One by one, the others crawled under, the Lingonai sandwiched between the other men, and Thorn bringing up the rear. Motioning silence, she led them to the thicket of bushes that screened one side of the goldfish pond. Duvey and Splinter were leaning over the edge of the pond. There it is, cried Splinter, leaning perilously and pointing. Way down there on the bottom, and it's my best marble. Would your mommy care if you got it for me? Duvey peered down. Marble go in water. "That's what I said," cried Splinter impatiently. "And you could shut your nose." He put his finger to the black, glistening button. "And fold your ears." He flicked them with his forefinger and watched them fold. "Gee," he said admiringly, "I wish I could do that." "Doovy go in water?" asked Doovy. "Yes," nodded Splinter. "It's my good taw, and you won't even have to put on swimming trunks. You got fur." Doovy shucked out of his brief clothing and slid down into the pond. He bobbed back up, his hand clenched. "Gee, thanks." Splinter held out his hand, and Doovy carefully turned his hand over, and Splinter closed his. Then he shrieked and flung his hand out. "You mean old thing!" yelled Splinter. "Give me my marble! That was a slippy old fish!" He leaned over, scuffling, trying to reach Doovy's other hand. There was a slither and a splash, and Splinter and Doovy disappeared under the water. Serena caught her breath and had started forward when Doovy's anxious face bobbed to the surface again. He yanked and tugged at the sputtering, coughing Splinter and tumbled him out onto the grass. Doovy squatted by Splinter, patting his back and alternately whistling dolefully through his nose and talking apologetic-sounding Lingonai. Splinter coughed and dug his fists into his eyes. "Golly, golly," he said, spatting his hands against his wet jersey. "Mommy'll sure be mad. My clean clothes all wet. Where's my marble, Doovy?" Doovy scrambled to his feet and went back to the pond. Splinter started to follow, then he cried. "Oh, Doovy, where did that poor little fish go? It'll die if it's out of the water. My guppy did." "Fish?" asked Doovy. "Yes," said Splinter, holding out his hand as he searched the grass with intent eyes. "The slippy little fish that wasn't my marble." The two youngsters scrambled around in the grass until Doovy whistled and cried out triumphantly, "Fish!" and scooped it up in his hands and rushed it back to the pond. "There," said Splinter. "Now it won't die. Looky, it's swimming away." Doovy slid into the pond again and retrieved the lost marble. "Now," said Splinter, "watch me and I'll show you how to shoot." The bushes beyond the two absorbed boys parted, and Mrs. Pink stepped out. She smiled at the children, and then she saw the silent group on the other side of the clearing. Her eyes widened, and she gave an astonished whistle. The two boys looked up and followed the direction of her eyes. "Daddy!" yelled Splinter. "Did you come to play?" And he sped, arms outstretched, to Thorn, arriving only a couple of steps ahead of Doovy, who was whistling excitedly and rushing to greet the tall lavender Lingonai. Serena felt a sudden choke of laughter at how alike Thorn and the Lingonai looked, trying to greet their offspring adequately and still retain their dignity. Mrs. Pink came hesitantly to the group to stand in the circle of Serena's arm. Splinter had swarmed up Thorn, hugged him with thoroughness, and slid down again. "Hi, General Worsham," he said, extending a muddy hand in a belated remembrance of his manners. "Hey, Daddy, I'm showing Doovy how to play marbles, but you can shoot better than I can. You come show him how." "Well," said Thorn, glancing uncomfortably at General Worsham. General Worsham was watching the Lingonai as Doovy whistled and fluted over a handful of bright-colored glassies. He quirked an eyebrow at Thorn and then at the rest of the group. "I suggest a recess," he said, "in order that we may examine new matters that have been brought to our attention." Serena felt herself getting all hollow inside, and she turned her face away so Mrs. Pink wouldn't see her cry. But Mrs. Pink was too interested in the colorful marbles to see Serena's gathering, hopeful tears.